The 9800 X3D. When I started tuning this thing, I followed some online resources, some guides, some videos on YouTube, etc. I realized something pretty early on. I had maxed my silicon. I'd got my consecutive highest scores in Cinebench. And then I went into the game testing and discovered that I hadn't improved the 1%. In some cases, I was getting slightly more FPS, but in my case, I'm only doing in game testing. Therefore, you're going to have run to run variance. So I don't really care about average FPS. I only care about it in relation to 1% lows. Matter of fact, if I could tick down the average FPS, if I knew that the 1% lows would stay where they were, I'd do it every time. I'm all about reducing that gap between average FPS and 1% lows, all I really care about. So with that focus, it tends to color your decisions when you're tuning and optimizing. What you find is you don't really need to prioritize VF efficiency to the point that you're getting great scores in Cinebench or whatever. It's the question is how, what's the goal? And the question is how does that relate to game performance? And it's game performance that you want to improve. And if you're tuning your system for gaming, you've got to improve the 1%. I mean, that's it. So I'm going to explain a few of my premises going into this testing. Just to be clear, you don't have to agree with them, but you have to understand them. Otherwise, you're not going to understand my choices because I've done this a little bit differently. I sort of uh, uh, looked at this a different way after I just stopped listening to everyone and just only cooking to my tastes. And, this is what I came up with. So I'm going to share all of those optimization passes. I'm going to share my game results, whether I was able to improve those 1%. I'm going to talk about when you are chasing frames, the types of games and situations in which you are actually chasing frame rate. And I'm going to go over the question of 1% lows, like what they actually are and where they come from and how to improve them depending on the architecture that you're playing with. And then I'm going to go into the hidden benefit of ray tracing. But for now, let's just talk about these 1%. Why do 1% lows even exist? We know what they are. They're the average frame rate of the slowest 1% of rendered frames. But why are these the slowest frames? Why are some frames faster to render than others? A frame is slow when the CPU has to wait. It's as simple as that. The CPU sends draw calls, commands through an API, DirectX 12, Vulkan, whatever, that tell the GPU exactly what geometry to render and which textures and shaders to apply. If the CPU has the data and instructions it needs, it will execute them at a predictable rate. When it doesn't have the data, it stalls and you get your 1% lows. Now, why wouldn't it have the data? Well, that differs by architecture. In an earlier video, I explained how to improve 1% lows on Raptor Lake through refresh tuning, TRFC and TREFI. Memory is stored in DRAM cells consisting of a capacitor and transistor. And I'll put my TREFI short up here for you to check out. And capacitors leak. To prevent data loss, those cells have to be refreshed. During those refresh events, the memory banks are locked. They can't be used for games, for anything. The portion of the memory being refreshed is blocked from CPU access. Increasing TREFI means memory is refreshed less frequently. Decreasing TRFC means the refreshes don't last as long. When those DRAM resources are freed up through decreasing the refresh duty, the speed of those frequent accesses increases, the CPU stalls less often, and the 1% lows improve. Now, the cache access path is very different on an X3D system. It's L1, L2, the CCD's L3, the stacked L3, and only after all that does it go to system DRAM. That stacked L3 layer is much faster than system memory and will absorb most of the draw call burst. So on a Raptor Lake system, refresh tuning unlocks optimal 1% lows. I showed that in my testing. DRAM tuning on the X3D variants of the AM5 platform yields diminishing returns because DRAM is simply less critical. So where do the 1% lows live on this platform? X3D chips run at lower voltages. They have tighter thermal and electrical limits. They have more conservative boosting. They have lower frequency ceilings. So when the vCore microspikes to adjust to draw calls, inconsistent delivery of voltage will cause the most resource demanding frames to suffer. Therefore, the key to the most optimal 1% lows on this architecture is vCore consistency. And this is of critical importance when tuning one of these systems. Because it's so very easy to be led astray by these VF curve bros who brag about their Cinebench scores. I say, well, I'm getting 1,500 in Cinebench 2024, and my idle vCore is only 1.05 volts. And they're really proud of themselves. And what happens is the vCore is too low because they pulled the curve down. And when it spikes for a game load, the VRMs are slow to respond because they always are. And you get undershoot in response to the spike. The capacitors around the CPU have to dump to bridge that gap. Similarly, when the cores transition under low load rapidly to an idle state, the VRMs, again, slow to respond. And the capacitors have to soak in a little bit of that electrical charge, again, to cover the gap between the VRMs and the core. So that's overshoot. The shooting and overshooting and undershooting is what the VRM does, not what the VRMs do, not what the cores do. So it's very easy to be led astray by those guys, but they're boosting and they're getting 5.6 gigahertz and breaking records in Cinebench or whatever, and their 1% lows are not great, which is why they're not showing you any gaming results. So they're showing you curve efficiency, but not gaming results. That's, and honestly, that's probably because they don't play them. So, but because if they did play games, they'd realize that boosting isn't the goal. Boosting is a means of reaching the goal. The goal is stable voltage at the frequencies that games actually use. So to illustrate this, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about that VF curve. Okay, so here's a sample curve. I can kind of show you how this works. There's no voltage numbers here because it's not important right now. I really just want you to get a sense of the shape of this thing. So how it actually works is like this. So you see 4.8 gigahertz up here at the top. This is the stock boost. And then you can adjust it, get it to boost to 5.2, let's say, and that's the green line. Now, you don't tell it what to boost to. What you do is adjust the curve optimizer, or negative curve offset with curve optimizer, curve shaper, etc. And when you adjust the curve, say with a negative curve offset, what you're doing is decreasing the vCore. So you're decreasing the voltage level of the core to attain this boost. And by decreasing the voltage, you tell the algorithm, hey, you now have more thermal headroom, so how high can you boost me? So at stock, with that level of thermal headroom, which is right here, it says I can boost you to 4.8 gigahertz. Then if we lower the core voltage to here, now it says, ooh, I have more thermal headroom. I can boost you to 5.2. And then over here with curve shaper, what we have here, I'm trying to depict my curve. So if you look at this, like this line right here, let's say I'll extend it, you can see that's medium range, which for Curve Shaper means 4.5 to 5 gigahertz. And at that medium range, I've given it a certain negative offset, and then I've increased it for the gaming range, which is the high range, which is 5.0 to 5.5 gigahertz, and that's why that line goes up right here until you get to 5.5, and then it just goes up because I left it on its auto setting because I'm never going to get to 5.5. So you can shape it that way, and that will have obviously a corresponding effect on the voltage to the cores. Now, this brings me to the subject of the 200 megahertz boost. It's a feature on these AM5 motherboards. I call it a gimmick. And here is why. Because if you were going to tune this curve so as to get to 5.4 gigahertz, let's say, then you would pull V-core down further, and your curve would end up going, like something like at 5.4, it'd be up here, right? And then your curve would go something like, this, right? Okay, so you'd pull V-core down a little bit more to get that boost. Now, that is not at all how it happens when you put that 200 megahertz boost. It's not up to the curve anymore. What you've done here is taken that line. So here's when you turn on the gimmick 200 megahertz boost. What it's going to do is increase your V-core. It's going to increase your voltage, and your curve is going to go like over here, right? Because now this will be your new voltage line. So normally you, and this is the point that I want to make about boosting, okay? As I said, the most important thing in this architecture is your V-core consistency, because that is what leads to the efficient processing of draw calls and your best 1% lows. Why do you boost? Boosting is a means to an end. As you see here with this curve, you boost in order to lower the V-core if you need to. You scale back on the boosting if you need more voltage in the core. What matters is the voltage consistency, the voltage amount and consistency in the cores. That's what matters. You use the curve to achieve the optimal results. The VF Curve Bros have it backwards. They're thinking in terms of boosting, and they think that is the goal. But if they played games, they'd see that the boost will give you diminishing returns. And what really matters is the core's response to transient spikes. And what really matters for the stability of these systems is when the core rapidly transitions to idle states. Idle instability is a big problem on these platforms. So you must make sure that you have a decent amount of voltage in the core. It doesn't have to be, you don't have to be kissing 1.3 or anything. You don't have to be drawing 150 watts of package power in a game, but you have to make sure there's enough. And if all you think about is boosting the curve, then as you can see right here, the more you get that boost curve up, the more you get that curve to boost, the lower your V-core is going to be. And you might get a situation when you get a gaming load of undershoot because your cores are starved. Similarly, if you have good performance with the voltage, good voltage consistency, you're going to chew up those draw calls. Your games are going to perform better. You're going to have better 1% lows. So I suspect that there's not a whole hell of a lot of crossover between PC nerds and baseball fans. I might be the only one. But being a baseball fan, an analogy came to mind when I was thinking about this CPU testing here. and that's batting average. In the world of baseball, batting average is gradually becoming more and more outmoded. Fewer people care about batting average. They're looking at WOBA and WAR and barrel rate and all these types of things that help determine a player's value over the course of a 162 game season, which is why every front office has these analytics departments. Now, what is the analogy? It's to average FPS. Average FPS in our world is becoming outmoded, or at least it ought to be. It's not becoming outmoded fast enough for my taste. Average FPS is absolutely meaningless, divorced from 1% lows. If you're not putting those two numbers together and relating them to each other, you're not telling me anything. When you're tuning with improvement of 1% lows in mind, then you're no longer vulnerable to the misinformation spread by toggle heads and the VF curve bros. You're actually focused on something real, something playable. Now that delta, the way I calculate it, by the way, is I subtract the 1% lows from the average FPS. I take that number and I divide it by the average FPS to produce delta as percentage of average FPS. Okay, that's my focus. That's my way of looking at it. That's not what I would call an advanced metric. What I would call an advanced metric would be something like animation error. And if you look at GN's white paper video that they did on animation error a couple months ago, he says, no, it's not the same thing as frame time stability, but it's highly, highly correlable. So basically anything that has to do with the smoothness, the playability of your game, what it's mostly going to have to do with is your frame time stability, which I call delta, or delta as percentage of average FPS. This is all that matters in single player games. So when you hear product comparisons of so-and-so CPU gives me this many frames in Ghosts of Tsushima and that many frames in Cyberpunk, it's so the fuck what? It doesn't matter. All that matters in these games is the delta between average FPS and 1% lows. That is your playability. That is your immersion. That is the most important focus for you to have, in my opinion, for any type of game. But it's not the only one for a certain subset of games, and those are your shooters, your Warzone, your CS2. In these games, you do want to drive up frames as much as you can. You don't want screen tearing, but short of that, you want to drive as many frames as you can. And let me explain why that is. So let's take 1000 milliseconds. That'll be our constant because that's how many milliseconds are in a second. We'll divide that by 250 frames per second to get a nice, neat frame rendered every 4 milliseconds. And let's assume a 5 millisecond response time for your mouse click. So if you look at this graph here, the white lines are those 4 milliseconds, 4, 8, 12, and so on. And the green lines are your input response at every 5 milliseconds, 5, 10, 15, etc. So after the first frame is rendered, assuming they both started at the same place at 5 milliseconds, you've got this input. And then at 8 milliseconds, you've got your next frame. That means that you had 4 milliseconds right here of stale data. Our next input is at 10 milliseconds, and it now has 2 milliseconds of stale data. Now, your input is only registered as fast as the frame is rendered. So you're waiting for the frame to render so that that input can translate into something playable. Now, what if we can bump frame rate? Take a look at the red right here, which is all your stale data, and let's bump it to 500 FPS. And look, there's barely any stale data anymore because now we're rendering a frame every 2 milliseconds. It's really about that simple. And that right there is the reason that frame time stability is not your only consideration in these shooter titles, especially if you're playing competitively. But don't get it twisted, please. This still doesn't matter anywhere near as much as delta as percentage of average FPS. That is really your main concern when tuning your system, because that's what you're going to feel. I mean, if you're playing competitively, you might be trying to drive up frame rates, but if you're hitching and micro stuttering, that's going to disrupt you when you're trying to teabag someone as well. So don't get it twisted. 90, maybe 95% of this is the delta between average FPS and 1% lows. Okay, so we start off at a baseline with pass 0. This is simply optimized defaults plus the Expo profile enabled. And I did all the game benchmarks at stock, and then I did them at the very end, and everything in between is kind of a mishmash here. So that's something to keep in mind about these settings. What I'm presenting to you are my final system settings here. But it was a long walk to Robin Hood's barn to get there, because I played with absolutely everything. So let's go on to pass 1. This is signal integrity, core, and memory. That's what I call it. And it's just about establishing electrical headroom for the ensuing changes. The SoC powers the non-CPU core parts of the chip, primarily the memory controller, Infinity Fabric, and PCIe controllers. The integrated memory controller and Infinity Fabric are the bridges between processor and RAM. The IMC is located within the SoC, and if it doesn't have sufficient voltage, you'll BSOD. So we tick this up for electrical headroom before adjusting FCLK. What are we talking about when we talk about FCLK, CPU VDDIO, DRAM VDDQ, SoC, etc.? We're talking about communication between disparate components across the motherboard. In other words, signal integrity. VDDIO powers the I/O interface on the CPU side of the memory bus. FCLK dictates how fast data moves between the CCD and the IOD. So you've got a CCD and an IOD on the 9800X3D. The CCD is where your stacked L3 lives. The IOD is your IO die, okay, which is your signal integrity hardware domain of the signal integrity. So so when your system is like, if you did a hardware info log at idle, you'd notice that the IOD is the source of most of the temps, where your CCD might be like around 30 to 35, your IOD would be like 40 to 45. So when they say these things idle high, that's really the IOD. And as you stress the system, the CCD will take over as the greater contributor of temperature. But the IOD is always electrically awake. It does not idle. It doesn't park or anything like that. It's always humming. And so that's where your heat comes from at idle. So I tend to bump all these signal integrity voltages prior to any tuning pass in order to establish, like I said, that electrical headroom for the changes I'm about to make. Now, there's signal integrity, there's also core logic. So what is DRAM voltage, or DRAM VDD? That's the DRAM's core logic, and those cores are the ICs, the internal memory chips, which store and maintain data bits. I also bumped this for electrical headroom before adjusting timings. CPU core voltage, or CPU VDD, is the core logic of the CCD. It supplies power to the CPU cores and the V-cache. Here it says auto, but believe me, I played around with every single setting. I played with several offsets and eventually decided that I just wanted to use the curve to adjust core voltage. boost higher and you reduce core voltage, scale back the negative curve optimizer offset, and you increase core voltage. I began to look for opportunities to let the curve do the work for me. That's one of the freedoms that this architecture allows. UCLK equals memclock. Memclock keeps the memory controller, UCLK, and the DRAM clock, MCLK, in a 1-to-1 ratio, meaning that they're both running at the same frequency. My RAM is 6,000 megatransfers per second, which means its actual clock is 3,000 megahertz. This setting sets UCLK to 3,000 megahertz. Because the two are synchronous, every time the RAM completes a clock cycle, the memory controller does as well, meaning that data flows from the RAM to the controller without needing to be buffered to a different speed. FCLK 2100. This is your fabric clock. So again, just bumping that signal integrity speed a little bit. I decided to increase TRFC and decrease TREFI because I really suspect that returns from memory tuning are somewhat diminishing on this architecture, and those can become sources of instability, which I talked about extensively on Raptor Lake. But on Raptor Lake, the refresh tuning is much more consequential, so it's worth dialing these in. I left them conservative here. The rest of the timings are from the tightest memory preset. Now, motherboard vendors set refresh behavior for the worst case scenario of your DIMMs. Not your DIMMs, not your temperatures, not your timings. So the refreshing will occur before the TREFI interval expires for safety's sake. That's called refresh pull-in. And high efficiency mode mitigates that. It allows the rows to reach closer to the actual TREFI limit and avoids refreshing rows that still have plenty of charge left. And it also avoids scattering refresh commands between read-write bursts. Now, the PLL, that's called phase-locked loop, is a tiny circuit that keeps the CPU's clock running at the speed it's supposed to. LN2 mode alters the PLL's internal behavior to keep the CPU stable when you're using liquid nitrogen cooling. It locks the clock signal on the basis of the expectation of extremely cold temperatures. At room temperatures, this can cause boost instability and clock jitter, which often result in random WHEA errors, and that's why we disable it. Memory context restore is AMD's version of fast boot. Disable it when you're tuning to make sure that your memory goes through all its proper training between reboots. Now, on this channel, I always say you cook to your tastes. Don't copy someone else's numbers. You decide how you want your system to behave. You know, little enough in this life is truly up to you. So when you get the chance, cook to your tastes. Well, this is where I cook. See, because I have this preference. And if you saw the latency video, you already know it. Everything stays awake at all times. If I can help it, nothing sleeps, nothing idles. Because anything that powers down, sleeps, and idles takes time to power up, wake up, and start up. And that time that it takes is called wake up latency. This always awake philosophy starts with C states. It doesn't matter the platform, the CPU, the boost algorithm, whatever. There is never a scenario where I want my cores entering deep sleep. C states introduce wake up latency, ramp up time for the voltage rails, frequency ramp up time, scheduling jitter, you name it. If you want to save power, pay attention to the AC kitchen supplies in your house. You know, you can run your toaster less often. Don't blow dry your hair. But you can miss me with the DC computer components. My shit stays awake. And power down enable is C states for the memory controller. Because memory power down can add a few nanoseconds of wake up latency. It can interfere with your memory timing, so you can miss me with that too. Now, here's the deal, folks. I gotta be honest with you. People can glaze AMD all they want, and they sure do. Boy, oh boy. the stroke job is just crazy, you know? Like, to me, everything's broken out of the box. But, you know, anyway, but I'm in a ton of PC and building and hardware enthusiast forums, and every single day I see multiple posts of people complaining about idle instability, and when I ask them their specs, it's always 9800X3D, 7800X3D, AMD. So don't tell me there's no there. I experienced a lot of this myself at stock settings, and I gradually made it better and better with tuning. Now, what I think is happening is that AMD aggressively drops its voltage rails at idle to chase efficiency, which can cause the system to fail to meet the boost algorithm's expectations, especially when tuning FCLK, memory timings, curve optimizer offsets, etc. So setting PSIC to typical current idle forces the CPU to maintain a slightly higher minimum power draw rather than dropping to the absolute lowest energy state. On this AM5 platform, I think it's worth it to set this to typical current idle as a safety measure. Link state power management, or sometimes you can call it active state power management, is sleep states for the PCIe lanes, basically. Disabling it means the fully active L0 state is constant. The link can idle, but it can't sleep, so voltage and current don't collapse, and this eliminates sudden load transients. I'd go as far as saying that if you don't want to be spending a lot of time investigating bug checks after crashing, get rid of all this power-saving bullshit. Now, just as you have C0 as your active CPU state and C1 and onward as your sleep states, you also have a full CPU power state P0 with P1, P2, P3 representing progressively lower clocks and voltages. You can imagine what I think of that. And there's this thing called ACPI, Advanced Configuration and Power Interface, which standardizes the operating system's interactions with hardware components. Now, PSS, Processor Performance States, is an ACPI mechanism which allows the OS to request these lower power settings. Disabling it tells the OS to don't even bother asking, right? So again, that fits with everything I'm saying here. Eliminate all deep idle transitions, keep the CPU electrically awake at all times, prevent the platform from collapsing voltage rails. Collaborative processor performance control lets the OS identify and utilize the best cores, especially for single-threaded tasks. Setting it to preferred driver lets Windows decide the preferred cores based on CPPC performance ranking. It reads that ranking even with game mode disabled. My thinking was that setting it to driver dovetails nicely with my curve optimizer tuning, since I've already identified my two best cores with Ryzen Master and given them additional boost. Other options for this setting include frequency, which simply picks the cores with the highest advertised boost potential and tries to use them as much as possible. I don't like that because I think it increases the likelihood of poor residency, because if a different core becomes slightly better in the moment, the scheduler may bounce threads to it. If you're using a dual CCD CPU like a 9950X3D, you might set this to the cache option to ensure that games run on the CCD with the stacked L3. BCLK is the master clock multiplier, right? It's the master 100 megahertz that the clock multiplies everything from. It's not the multiplier, it's what it multiplies from. So like, for example, like your RAM is 3000 megahertz, and that's BCLK, which is 100 megahertz times the multiplier of 30, right? So spread spectrum wobbles that clock to smear electromagnetic interference spikes for regulatory testing. Stock systems can tolerate that wobble, but we're overclocking, not shipping motherboards, so we disable it to keep BCLK perfectly stable. These PBO limits are all stock values, so I'm just telling my system that when it boosts beyond stock frequency, it does so according to stock power and current limits. So the boosting works like this. Lower voltage leads to higher efficiency leads to more headroom leads to higher boost. But that's governed by AMD's FIT model, failure in time, which says don't exceed this current density or that thermal stress or this voltage droop, etc. Now, Scalar relaxes those guardrails. Scalar doesn't get you higher boosts, but it adjusts voltage to sustain higher boost. It ticks voltage up to hold boost longer. I don't mind Scalar. I hate the boost override, but I feel similarly about both. When this system performs as it's supposed to, boost and vCore are inversely proportional. More of one means less of the other. I prefer not to disrupt that relationship. I prefer to work within the curve only. The negative magnitudes here are based on my best boost cores. Number 1 and number 2 are, for me, core 4 and 6, so I chose a greater undervolt for those and left the others at negative 15. These Windows settings echo my BIOS settings. The bitsum plan comes with Process Lasso. It ensures that the cores don't get parked. It locks minimum processor state to 100%. It turns off idle promote, so you can see the latency video for a more in-depth review of these settings. And by keeping high priority tasks on the best cores, it helps reduce thread migration. And it's not just about the CPU. This plan keeps PCIe links in L0 and USB controllers from downshifting. It disables selective suspend. It's basically, I'd say, 50% of the Windows portion of my latency optimization video in one power plan. Now, there are people who say that you need to use the balanced power plan for these X3D variants. My argument is, fuck that. It doesn't fit with my philosophy. But just to expand on that a little, balanced is built on certain assumptions that you'll let the cores park and sleep, that devices can idle, etc. And those are not my assumptions or expectations. My priorities are latency and predictability. Now, based on this, you're probably thinking I'm running hot. That is not the case at all. I'll get to that later. Now, on dual CCD CPUs like the 9950X3D, game mode disables CCD1, the non-X3D CCD, and forces games to run on Core 0, where they should run. But this is a single CCD processor, so that's irrelevant to me. And CPP-C can see, with my tuning, that my best cores are already my most efficient ones. Setting the preferred cores to drivers should help with this as well, so I don't need any further foreground biasing or thread migration hints from my OS. My prior preferences have made game mode redundant. It can only cause confusion on my setup. And here all I'm doing is a bit of final curve tuning with Pass 3, just curve shaper here. I shaped it with maximum boost within the high frequency range, which is where you sit in games, but not too much boost because I want healthy and stable vCore, not minimum possible vCore. The -4 at medium range is simply so we don't have some big cliff at the high range. So the whole curve moves from a small cliff at medium to its highest boost at the gaming range, and then nothing for max frequency because I'm not ever going to get there. And here are the final settings all in one place, so you can pause the video and take a look at these if you like. Now, a lot of people are going to tell you that there's no point in testing 1080p because nobody plays 1080p. Well, first of all, those people aren't looking at Steam surveys. And if they're going to argue that there's no point in testing 1080p, then what's the point of testing CPUs at all? I mean, if you only test 1440p on up, the CPU doesn't have any work to do, so there's not going to be any difference between any of them. 1080p is where you isolate the CPU's performance. Once the pixel count goes up, The GPU has more work to do, and since it's so busy, the CPU finishes its work early and just waits there. Its utilization appears low, and its actual performance is masked. Why do we test at 1080p? Because there's no point in testing a CPU at any other resolution. But obviously, this thinking has its limitations too. I mean, otherwise, we'd be testing at 720p, 480p. Obviously, you have to make some attempt at reflecting real world use case. But let's say, for the sake of argument, that I agree with him. Nobody plays 1080p, and not only do I agree, I'm doubling down. So most of this testing does not reflect an actual use case. So hat tip to Blackbird PC Tech for this one. He was in some sort of tiff with Hardware Unboxed over some fucking snide comment that Steve made over there. Now, that drama doesn't particularly concern me, but something that Blackbird said in that video was very, very interesting. He said, if you're isolating the CPU at 1080p, then why test at high graphics settings at 1080p? I mean, not only is it useless to test CPUs at 1440p and 4K, it's useless to test at 1080p high. Whether you increase the pixel count or increase the graphics settings, as soon as the GPU gets busy enough to force the CPU to wait on it, you kind of lose your testing sandbox. Now you're testing the GPU. So all of this testing is at 1080p. But not only that, the more CPU intensive testing is at 1080p low settings. Yes, as Blackbird said. But not only that, but I'm going to try to further isolate the CPU with some custom graphics settings. I'm not going to review every game settings right now. If you'd like to see all of the test conditions, please join the Discord. I'll find a way to make all that available to you. It's too much to review in one video, but I'll use one game, Cyberpunk 2077, to illustrate what I call max CPU testing. I have gone through each and every graphics setting in the game, isolated the CPU, the more CPU dependent ones from the GPU dependent ones, increased the CPU dependent settings, and left the GPU dependent ones on low. And this logic is simple. We're not just testing the CPU, we're stressing the CPU. Any frame time spike you see with these settings is purely CPU driven. We're talking about scheduling stalls, cache misses, power limit transitions, fluctuations in voltage. Every single thing comes to the surface, and so does your tuning. So with these settings, you'll know whether your undervolt is stable or just marginal. You'll know whether the VNF of the VF curve are balanced, and you'll know right away. If anything's slightly off, your 1% will suffer. On top of that, it's actually really fun to engineer this extremely constraining environment for the CPU and then liberate it in the next graphics pass by, say, turning on ray tracing or high settings. It's like the CPU is saying, oh, thank you, thank you. And if you can achieve great 1% lows under these constraints, just wait to see how well your games run when the GPU starts pulling its own weight. We turn VSync off because if the GPU can't cap frame rate, the CPU will run as fast as it is able. Contact shadows off. These are tiny local shadows where feet touch ground, small creases in fabric, etc. That's all GPU post-process. Resolution scaling off. I only test it native. I usually only play it native. Frame gen off is pretty obvious. Honestly, the only reason to test with frame gen enabled is if you're testing frame gen. Texture quality low, that's all VRAM bound. All ray tracing, path tracing is off. We're going to talk about ray tracing in a bit, its hidden benefit, but I think it's obvious for now why this is an entirely GPU bound setting. Film grain, chromatic aberration, depth of field, lens flare, motion blur, vignette, that's all GPU post-processing. Volumetric fog resolution, volumetric cloud quality. This is light interacting with air and fog, etc. It does involve some CPU culling work to tell the GPU which light sources are close enough to the fog to be worth calculating, but it's minimal compared to the GPU's duties. Anisotropy gives objects viewed at a distance higher visual fidelity. It happens within the texture units of the GPU. SSR is GPU post-processing. Subsurface scattering affects how light interacts with translucent stuff like skin and fabric. That's all GPU post-processing as well. Ambient occlusion is soft shadows, separate from the main lighting engine that add finer detail. And color precision, turning that to its lowest setting, reduces the VRAM cost. Now, remember that the CPU and GPU do not work independently of one another. When the CPU has nothing to do, the CPU is not waiting, so it has to work faster or idle gaps will appear. And when graphics settings are low, frame rate goes up. At 60 FPS, the CPU does its rendering workload 60 times per second. At 360 FPS, that workload goes up by 600%. And it's not as if we're just making the CPU do more work because we're driving more frames. We're also increasing the amount of work it has to do per frame, which brings us to crowd density. That's the big one. That means more AI, more culling, which is the CPU deciding what's in and out of the player's view. It means more pathfinding, which is what keeps the NPCs from walking into walls. It means more animation, positions and angle changes, physics simulations of the NPCs, and it means more draw calls. Field of view, turning it high means more objects are visible, which means more culling, more draw calls. Local shadow mesh, this is the CPU determining which objects can cast shadows and culling the ones that aren't in the picture. Local shadow quality increases the complexity of shadow maps, which increases draw calls. Cascaded shadows range, cascaded shadows resolution. Larger shadow distance means more objects are included in the shading pass, which means the CPU has more decisions to make. Max dynamic decals. Decals are cracks in pavement, puddles, blood splatter, bullet holes. Now their appearance is GPU bound, but the setting is max dynamic decals, which to me implies quantity. So with more of them, you have more CPU draw calls. And the dynamic part implies the life of the decal. And if the decals are, if the bullet hole stays in the wall for longer, that increases the concurrent object count, which is something that the CPU tracks. Mirror quality high. Yes, the GPU does the rendering, but the CPU has to prepare the scene twice. And then LOD is another big one. Higher LOD settings means more complex meshes being rendered further away from the player, which forces the CPU to issue thousands of additional commands per frame. Low GPU settings make the CPU work more often. High CPU settings make the CPU work harder. And together, they create this CPU stress test. And we also have some more neutral settings here, like low latency. This reduces the render queue for the best input latency. Now, you could argue that doing so can expose microstutter, and that might be an interesting thing to test, but I chose to leave it off for clarity, predictability, and frame delivery. And distant shadows resolution. These are very distant shadow maps. They don't require a lot of per frame culling. Improved facial geometry, negligible impact on both the CPU and GPU. It enhances the complexity of existing facial meshes, but it doesn't add new ones. If all the settings are low, then both the GPU and CPU have less to think about. Now, what we've done with these max CPU custom settings is to leave the GPU waiting, but give the CPU a lot more to think about. More meshes, more NPCs, more shadow casting objects, more animations, more AI, more culling. more objects to track, update, cull, animate, and simulate. More frames and more work per frame. That's how I test the CPU. Even though I'm increasing the more CPU dependent settings and leaving the more GPU dependent settings lower, I'm still increasing overall graphical load. But that low preset, if it were just a low preset, that can hide scheduling inefficiencies, memory latency issues, problems with your OC, problems with your undervolt, etc. You're simply not asking the CPU to do a lot of hard work. So what I'm doing here is asking the CPU to work not faster, but harder. More L3 and DRAM fetches, more branch predictions, etc., because I'm increasing the settings that most heavily rely on CPU compute. And that will, in turn, increase GPU load, which will increase CPU wait time, and the effective clocks are lower than just at low presets. So in short, the average effective clocks go up when you increase the CPU's work per second, not its complexity per frame. With these settings, I'm interested in doing the opposite. Average effective clocks will go down as we increase the complexity per frame. I want to say one other thing about the testing before I move on to it, and this comes in the form of a solemn oath that I make to you. I will never again test built-in benchmarks. They run the same camera path every time. They preload assets in predictable ways. They avoid the thread scheduling, thread contention that happens during real gameplay. And this means they're more predictable. There are fewer cache misses. Any of the problems that you might have in games, you are not going to have in a built-in benchmark. And the only thing that's advantageous about testing built-in benchmarks is that they avoid run-to-run variance. But I just said all I give a shit about is the distance between average FPS and 1% lows and getting that gap as narrow as possible. So what do I care about run-to-run variance? I mean, maybe I'll get 250 frames in Cyberpunk. Maybe I'll be running around in Night City with crowd density turned all the way up and I'll only get 170. It doesn't matter. Being that that's my focus, why should I really care about run-to-run variance? Also, big dips, if you're playing a big map, big frame time dips, I'm going to find them. I'm going to play the dip. I'll be in the dip because I'm going to play the map. I'm going to play the whole map. And my passes are long. Also, let me tell you, if you ever want to experience the depression of never being able to play any games, start a fucking tech channel. I mean, it's just unbelievable how much work that goes into this. And then you don't have time to play any games. So this has got to be fun for me. And I like playing games. So from now on, I'm only going to test actual gameplay. And I don't care what type of game it is, whether it's an RTS or whether it's a shooter, or whether it's a single player game. So all of these benchmarks are in-game. So all testing is at 1080p. We have a mix of new and old games. Newer Cyberpunk 2077, Hogwarts Legacy, Horizon Zero Dawn Remastered, Warzone and Battlefield 6. And the older games, we want to test how old games interact with newer hardware. Metro Exodus, Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and a separate video I have Ashes of the Singularity. That's going to be in a different video. Everything is uncapped. I do not cap frame rates when I'm testing. No DLSS unless noted. No frame gen. 9800 X3D, 5070 Ti, X870E carbon Wi-Fi, 2x16 ADI, AIO cooling, bottom and top intake, side and rear exhaust. And if you want to know why I did that fan configuration, go watch the fan configuration video. So that's it. Let's get into the graphics testing. So all I'm showing right now are the stock results versus the final results. If you want to see all of the testing and all of the many passes of each game with every single configuration, I'll try to include that in the data dump on Discord, but this is showing a decent reduction in that delta percentage between stock and the final pass, about what you'd expect. Ticking close to 20%, more than 15% anyway, reduction there. Pay no attention to the average FPS in these numbers. Could have been playing a different part of the map. It's not relevant to my testing anyway. But the delta is, and we're showing a reduction here. Moving on to Warzone, a more modest reduction here. And I actually got really good results in the MSPC latency and frame view in Warzone. I started at around pretty good, like 8.5 milliseconds, for pretty good for a stock result, and I got it down to around 7. So modest reduction here in that delta percentage. Moving on to Cyberpunk in the max CPU configuration. This is a tough game, and you know, I think anywhere around 30% is pretty decent for a stock result, but we shaved about 10% off of that. Now, Hogwarts really took off with this new tuning, more emphasizing the voltage part of the VF curve. Wow, nearly cutting it in half here, and a very, very smooth playing experience despite these very CPU constrained settings. Horizon Zero Dawn is another game very optimized for this architecture because it was a PS4 port, so it's had almost a decade to acclimate itself to that AMD ecosystem, and it really shows in playing this. The stock result again is quite good here. We were able to shave 10% off of it. Metro Exodus is an older game, that's why I included it here. Older games can present some problems with newer hardware. I wanted to see how it responded to these changes, and this is another huge improvement in the 1% lows with the last tuning pass. Shadow of the Tomb Raider, again, pretty significant, from 40% down to a tick over 30. And here we see the average reduction in this delta percentage between the stock and final results. 31.4% down to 24.8, which is really, I think, very good for a 7-game average, a 20% reduction there. And just to let you know, just because I'm focusing a little bit more on voltage and wanting to supply a consistent amount to the core, does not mean that we haven't dramatically improved these thermal results from stock. Average percentage reduction, a little over 15% in package temp, and a 22% reduction in package power for all these games. And to drive the point home, the best result for me was not the best result according to Cinebench 2024, when I was pushing 5.4 gigahertz with the lowest V-core that I could get. I had a 1397 score in Cinebench 2024. I repeated that score, so I was never able to get above it, which makes me think this is, we hit the limits of our silicon here. And again, those numbers look great. You go, well, why would you want to tick those up? We're still far more efficient than the stock results, but I just needed a little bit more V-core in there. You can see that your best boost behavior is not necessarily the best for gaming. And now let's have a little bit of fun. See this stock result for Cyberpunk, not the max CPU configuration, but once we start to add a little bit more GPU workload, we increase CPU wait time so the CPU isn't so stressed, and it is very thankful for that. We see a huge reduction in this delta percentage in the DLSS balanced plus ray tracing runs for Cyberpunk. Why can ray tracing stabilize frame times? Because it can. So think of it from this perspective. think of it from the perspective of fast frames versus slow frames. Okay. So when you get into Warzone and look up at the sky and get up into Verdansk and look at the sky, you know, your FPS shoots way the fuck up, right? Because those are frames that require very little computational effort from the CPU. Therefore they're rendered very, very easily. So you get into the map and look up at the sky, FPS shoots up. Okay. Now, ray tracing adds a heavy and consistent workload to every frame. It raises the time the GPU spends on each frame because every frame gets funneled into the lighting engine. But what about the slow frames? They're your 1% lows, and 1% lows are the result, as we've discussed, of CPU stalls, plain and simple. So a frame is slow when the CPU has to wait. It can stall from any number of things: voltage, frequency transitions, cache misses, synchronization points within the game engine, thread stalling, you name it. Now, ray tracing is not going to exacerbate those conditions. Those simulation stalls happen on the CPU side. They happen in the CPU's render preparation. And GPU raster and ray tracing happens further down the rendering pipeline. That's the key point. Ray tracing is a GPU side workload. 1% lows are CPU side events. So when you enable ray tracing, your average FPS plummets, but your lows stay where they are. This is why I recommend getting the card that, if you play a lot of single player games, that is, if you play a lot of single player games, get the card that's best at ray tracing. Ray tracing is like a one-click overclock, because the goal in optimizing single player games is to reduce the delta between average FPS and 1% lows. In single player games, all that matters is the immersion as you play the story, okay? Lowering those deltas is your only goal if you are optimizing your system to play single player games. You've got to get that delta as low as possible. Ray tracing does it with one click. It's going to bring down your average FPS closer to your lows. You're not chasing frames when you're playing Black Myth Wukong. Okay? You're not chasing input responsiveness when you're playing Ghosts of Tsushima. Okay? That's Warzone. That's CS2. That's when you're chasing frames. You're not chasing frames in single player games. So if you bring average FPS way down and the 1% stay where they are, that's tits. That's immersion. That's what you want. And ray tracing, not always, but it can have the effect of doing it with just one click. And then similarly for Horizon Zero Dawn, these are all the very last pass results where I did max CPU, high preset, and very high preset, and you can see what happens again when we increase a little bit that CPU wait time, let it breathe a little bit, make the GPU do a little bit more work, from 26%, which is a terrific result for those maximum CPU constrained settings, then more graphically demanding settings, liberating the CPU a little bit down to 22%, which is a terrific result, and again, increase graphic settings a little bit more in the very high preset, and now we're at a 20% this difference between average FPS and 1% lows, which is really a phenomenal result. So the goal of tuning your system for gaming is to improve your 1% lows. It's really as simple as that. You've got a V and an F in that VF curve, and you got to pay attention to both of them. Once you dial in that V core, the 1% lows should improve, and it won't necessarily be your most efficient or highest boosting curve that achieves that. Sometimes you got to pull that curve back a little bit, get a little bit more voltage into the core. That's going to help with scheduling, draw calls, all the work that the CPU has to do. It's going to narrow that gap between average FPS and 1% lows. But again, that is your goal, to narrow that gap. That's what tuning a system for gaming is about, not VF efficiency. And one of the great freedoms, this is one of the great pros to this architecture, is the amount of good that you can do just within the curve. You don't have to go outside the curve to the 200 megahertz boost. You don't even have to use core voltage offsets. I didn't have to bother much with LLC, with load line calibration. Pretty much the curve did everything I needed it to. When I wanted to tick up voltage, scale back the curve, take the curve optimizer offsets, bring them closer towards zero. That's going to bring more voltage into the core. And the 1% lows responded, but we saw an overall huge improvement in this system's thermal headroom, which is why we got that boost. So we're still able to boost, and we had our highest boost in the gaming frequency range. So we are still using the boost to great effect, but we're making sure that our voltage is stable, and you can achieve very, very stable voltage on this system just working within the curve and not messing around with any other settings or sometimes gimmicks. Another plus of this architecture was its stability under every form of load. I threw the kitchen sink at this thing, multiple days of Carhu testing, multiple days of core cycler with Prime 95, running with Y Cruncher, AVX testing, SSE testing, OCCT runs, multiple Cinebench runs, and multiple game runs. Total stability, like a rock, this thing, for every form of load I threw at it. That was great. The downside, idle, not so much. It was a struggle to get this thing stable. As I said before, at stock, this system was unstable. I had lots of idle crashes. And these are with very good temps. There was nothing wrong with the cooling, nothing wrong with the hardware, near as I could tell. Everything was operating seemingly as it should, but I just think that we had some inconsistency there in the voltage delivery at idle. So we had to kind of tick it up a little bit and get the voltage consistent. So where the idle was a little bit high, but it didn't boost too high. So as I began to tune this system, it got more and more and more stable until the point that it's at now, where it's really good at idle. But it took a little while getting there. And I don't think that that's the out of the box result that AMD wanted. And I know I'm not alone in noticing it. Not everybody had it, but I certainly did. And I know I'm not alone. But I believe that that is a voltage issue at idle, and we remedied that. There was one game that I left out of this testing, and that was Ashes of the Singularity, and I left it out because the results were so fascinating and I had so much to say about it that I decided to make it into a separate video. So that one is coming up, and I'm going to do some RAM testing. Our RAM situation is pretty awful right now, but that's why you got to be sure about what you're buying. So this is 2x16A that I got in there right now. I'm going to do a 2x24 and a 2x32 M die kit, and I'm going to try both of those in this system, and then we're going to get to the 5070 Ti testing as well. So if that content interests you and you believe in this vision of testing everything yourself and you don't know until you have tested it, then please like and subscribe, join the Discord. I'll see you in the next one.